The morning mist hung low over the pasture like smoke from a fire no one had set. Caleb Harlan stood at the gate of his ranch with the Winchester in his right hand, barrel pointed at the dirt, and watched the road from town the way a man watches a storm he cannot outrun. Behind him, through the open door of the house, a woman's voice carried across the kitchen. Calm, too calm, the kind of calm that takes years to build and seconds to lose. I will not go. You can tell my father you found me, but I will not go. Then another voice, a man's voice, low polished, the voice of someone who had never raised it because he had never needed to. Mrs. Harlan, this is no longer a request. Caleb lifted the Winchester, not aimed, not shouldered, just lifted the way you lift a thing to remind everyone present that it exists and that the man holding it has made a decision about how the next 60 seconds will go. On my land, Caleb said, everything is a request, and I am declining. The mist moved through the grass. Somewhere on the north ridge, a hawk called once and went silent. And in the yard between the house and the road, 3 men on horseback sat very still, recalculating the mathematics of a situation that had just changed. But that morning was still weeks away. And before any of it arrived, there was the letter. There was the silence. And there was the long, ordinary hollow of a life that had stopped moving 4 years ago and had not yet found a reason to start again. 10 weeks earlier, the land looked the same. It always looked the same. That was the thing about the Kansas plain. It did not care what you had lost or what you were carrying or how long you had been carrying it. It just lay there flat and gold and endless, and it asked nothing of you except that you keep working. And if you could not do that, it would go on without you and not notice the difference. Caleb Harlan had lived on this land for 11 years. He had built the house with lumber hauled from Wichita, and nails he bought on credit, and hands that bled for the first 3 months until the calluses came in thick enough to stop it. 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen. A porch that faced north because he liked watching the light on the ridge in the morning, though he would not have said that to anyone and no one had ever asked. His routine had not changed in 4 years. He woke before the sun, coffee black. No sugar because sugar cost money and because he had stopped tasting the difference. Out to the barn before first light. Check the horses, check the fence line, ride the north pasture if the weather allowed, back to the house by noon. Lunch was salt pork and cornbread from the day before eaten, standing at the counter, because sitting at the table alone felt like something he was not prepared to examine. Afternoons were fence work or feed or whatever needed doing. There was always something that needed doing. That was the mercy of a ranch. It did not leave you time to think, and when it did, you could always find another post that needed setting, another length of wire that needed stretching, another hour of honest labor that kept your hands busy and your mind pointed in a direction that did not lead to the room at the back of the house. The room at the back of the house. Every night on his way from the kitchen to the bedroom, Caleb passed that door. And every night he did the same thing. He stopped. He placed his hand flat against the wood just above the lock, and he held it there for the span of one breath. Then he dropped his hand and walked on. He did not open the door. He had not opened it in 4 years. Not since the week he came home from buying cattle in the next county and found Silas Briggs standing on the porch with an expression on his face that told Caleb everything before a single word was spoken. Silas had worked the ranch for 12 years. He had been there before Maeve arrived. He had been there through the years. Maeve was alive, and he had been there for the 4 years since she was not. In all that time, Silas Briggs had never once spoken her name. Not because he did not care, because Silas understood in the way that men of his generation and experience understood that there were things you did not say aloud, and the deepest respect you could offer another man was to not force him to hear them. One detail, small but it stayed. Every year on the anniversary of Maeve's passing, Caleb would find a bundle of wildflowers on the porch step before he woke. Silas never mentioned it. Caleb never thanked him. They both knew. That was enough. Silas was 58 years old and had carried a rifle through Shiloh and Chickamauga before he was 23, and he never spoke about either. He was lean and sun-dried and quiet in the way of men who had seen enough noise to last them the rest of their lives. He slept in the bunkhouse, ate his own cooking, and kept a Colt on his hip the way other men kept a watch in their pocket. Not for show. For the simple reason that the world in his experience had a habit of turning without warning, and a man who was not ready for it had no one to blame but himself. The letter. Caleb wrote it on a night he could not sleep, which was most nights, but this one was worse. He had walked past the locked room, placed his hand on the wood, held it for one breath as always, and then stood there for a second breath and a third. And he realized that he had been performing this ritual for 1,460 nights, give or take. The mathematics of grief laid out in the simplest terms. 4 years of touching a door he would not open in a house that was slowly dying because no one lived in it except him, and he was not entirely sure that what he was doing qualified as living. He sat at the kitchen table. He took a sheet of paper from the drawer. He wrote. The first draft said too much about Maeve. He read it back and it sounded like a eulogy, not an advertisement. He tore it up. The second draft said too little. It read like a notice for purchasing livestock. He tore that up too. The third draft found the right voice or something close to it. The voice of a man who had gotten used to being alone to the point where he had nearly forgotten that it was not the same thing as choosing to be alone. He read it back in the lamplight, and it did not sound like a eulogy, and it did not sound like a livestock notice. It sounded like a man who was being honest about what he could offer and what he could not, and who had enough self-awareness to know that the two lists were not equal in length. The first list was short, the second one went on for a while. He was clear. He wanted a woman of plain disposition, comfortable with hard work, unbothered by silence. He did not want beauty. He underlined the word partner. He described what he needed. Someone to manage the books, handle the household, take the cooking off his hands. Someone who would not ask why he slept on the porch in July. Someone who would not ask about the locked room. He sealed the letter himself. He rode to town on a Tuesday morning when the street was still empty. He handed it to Haskell at the post office, and Haskell, who had the professional discretion of a man who handled other people's mail for a living, took it without comment. No one in Dryden's Hollow knew what Caleb Harlan had written in that letter. Not Silas, not Haskell, and especially not Widow Crawford, who operated from a second-floor window above the dry goods store with the tireless vigilance of a woman who believed that other people's business was a public resource to be managed. 8 weeks passed. The reply came. A name, a date, a stage number. The arrangement service assured him he would be matched accordingly. The name was Edith. He read it once and did not think much of it. On the morning the stage was due, Caleb rode into town for wire and a box of nails. That was what he told himself. He needed wire. He needed nails. The fact that he ended up standing near the water trough across from the stage stop for longer than either errand required was, as far as he was concerned, a coincidence that did not merit examination. He was not waiting. He nearly believed it. The stage slowed on the main road just after noon. Dust rose behind it in a long, pale curtain that drifted east and dissolved. The horses pulled up. The driver set the brake. The door opened. 2 men stepped out first. A drummer with a sample case and a satchel who looked like he had been selling something for so long that he had become the thing he was selling. Then an older gentleman in a coat that had seen better decades who squinted at the sun as though it had personally offended him. Then a pause. The kind of pause that pulls at the eye even when you are trying very hard not to look. She stepped down without help. That was the first thing Caleb noticed. One hand on the door frame, the other smoothing her skirt with the practiced ease of someone who did not require assistance and did not intend to request it. She was tall for a woman. Her hair was dark, nearly black, pinned with what looked like plain wooden pins. Her dress was gray wool, simple, nothing extravagant. But the way she stood on that dusty road, scanning the street with steady gray eyes, she did not look like a woman arriving. She looked like a woman returning to a place she had already decided was hers. And that scan, Caleb saw it because he was watching, and because he had spent enough years reading animals and weather and the small movements of the land to know when something was not casual. Her eyes moved across the street in one breath. The alley beside the general store, the overhang of the blacksmith's shop, the second-floor window of the saloon. Not curiosity, assessment. The way a person checks a room before sitting down in it. The way a person who has been hunted looks at every new space as though it might contain the thing that is hunting them. Then her eyes found him. He did not know how. He was not a remarkable-looking man, broad-shouldered and sun-dark, and somewhere past 35, wearing a hat that needed replacing and a shirt with a tear at the left cuff he kept meaning to mend. There was nothing about him that should have drawn the eye from 50 feet away, but she was looking directly at him with an expression he could not read, And then she was crossing the street toward him with a small leather bag in her hand, and she said simply, "Mr. Harlan." Not a question, a confirmation. "Miss," he said. He had meant to say more, he did not. Up close, she was composed. That was the word he found after discarding several others he did not want to arrive at. Composed in the way of someone who had practiced composure until it became second nature, which told him instinctively that there had been a time when it was not. Her eyes moved quickly, not nervously, strategically. She glanced at the stage driver, at the street behind her, at the mouth of the alley, all in the space of a breath. Then she looked at him again, and whatever she was searching for, she seemed to reach a decision. "I hope the journey was not too difficult," he said. "You are the one I have come to," she said. "So I suppose that depends on what comes next." He picked up her bag before she could protest, and she looked like she was about to. She closed her mouth. They walked to the wagon. Across the street in the second-floor window above the dry goods store, Widow Crawford set her teacup down very slowly. She had seen Caleb Harlan standing near the stage stop, which was unusual. She had seen a woman she did not recognize step off the stage and walk directly to him, which was unprecedented. And she had seen Caleb Harlan pick up that woman's bag, which in 11 years of dedicated observation was the single most remarkable thing she had ever witnessed him do. The widow's eyes narrowed. Her mind began to work. On the wagon, Caleb and Edith sat with 2 feet of dusty air between them. He flicked the reins. The horse moved. Neither of them spoke for the first mile. It was Edith who broke the silence, but not in the way he expected. She did not ask about the house. She did not ask about the ranch hands or the neighbors or the nearest town with a proper store. She asked about the land. Is it flat all the way? Mostly. There is a ridge to the north. Creek runs along it. Does it flood in spring? He glanced at her sideways. It has. But you have managed it. I have managed it. A silence. Then she said almost to herself, good. That means it can be managed again. He had no response to that. He found to his mild irritation that he did not need one. The wagon rolled on. The afternoon light turned amber across the grass, and she sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the land the way someone looks at something they are trying to memorize before it is taken from them. He noticed that. He filed it away in the part of himself that noticed things he was not supposed to mention. When the wagon came within sight of the ranch, Silas Briggs was mending fence along the south pasture. He looked up. He saw Caleb and the woman sitting side by side on the bench, 2 feet of dust between them, and Silas did something he had not done in 12 years of working this land. He put down his hammer to watch, not out of curiosity, because Silas Briggs, with the instinct of a man who had lived 58 years and who had seen enough in the war to know that trouble had its own smell, recognized that something on this land had just changed. And change on the land required observation. He watched the wagon come up the road and stop at the house, and he watched Caleb climb down and walk around to the other side, and he watched the woman step down on her own before Caleb could offer his hand, and he watched her stand in the yard and look at the house and the barn and the north ridge with an expression that Silas could not read from this distance, but that he suspected if he could read, it would tell him something important. Then he picked up his hammer and went back to the fence because the fence still needed mending. And whatever was happening at the house would happen, whether Silas watched it or not. And a man who had survived Chickamauga had learned that the best way to be useful was to be ready, and the best way to be ready was to keep working until someone needed you to stop. The ranch house was 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen. Caleb had cleaned it the day before, or done what he called cleaning, which amounted to removing everything from the floor and stacking it against the walls in roughly organized piles that he suspected would not survive close inspection. Edith walked through the house without comment. She touched nothing. She looked at everything. The windows, the door hinges, the gap beneath the back door where the November wind would come through like a blade. She was taking inventory, and Caleb told himself she was simply being practical. She paused at the back room. The locked one. "Storeroom, though," he said before she asked. She turned and looked at him with that unreadable expression. The one that was not quite neutral and not quite searching, but existed in the space between the two, where most people did not know how to look. "Of course," she said, and moved on. He noticed that she did not try the handle. He noticed that she did not lean close to listen, the way some people do with locked doors, as though the silence behind them might have a different texture than the silence in front. She simply looked at the lock and at him and at the lock again, and then she walked away, and there was nothing in her movement that suggested she would not eventually come back to it. She simply understood, in whatever way she understood things, that this was not the moment. That first night, he ate alone on the porch while she organized the kitchen with a quiet efficiency that told him this was not the first time she had walked into a disordered space and made it obey her. He could hear the sounds of it through the open window. A pot moved to a different hook. A drawer opened, assessed, closed. Something ceramic set down with precision rather than convenience. These were sounds that had not existed in this house for a long time, and he sat with his coffee going cold and his pipe going out and listened to them the way a man listens to rain after a long drought, not quite believing it, not yet willing to trust it, but unable to stop listening. After a while, the sounds stopped and the house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. The quiet of a house with two people in it, each of them in their own room, each of them carrying their own silence, but sharing the same roof and the same four walls and the same night air coming through the same gaps in the same imperfect structure. It was not company, exactly. It was not comfort, but it was something. The first variation in a pattern that had not varied in 4 years, and Caleb sat with it on the porch and did not know what to do with it, and did nothing, which was, for Caleb Harlan, the correct response to most things he did not understand. The first week was a study in quiet efficiency. Edith reorganized the kitchen without asking permission, and Caleb did not offer resistance because the results were immediately and obviously superior to anything he had managed on his own. She moved pots to where they were reachable. She arranged the pantry by frequency of use, rather than by the mysterious system Caleb had been operating under, which appeared to be based on whichever shelf an item landed on when he was done with it. She found the account books on the second day. By the end of the third day, she had identified $42 in errors accumulated over 2 years. She corrected them in a single afternoon with a handwriting so precise it looked like typeset, and she did not mention it to Caleb until he noticed the new figures himself, at which point she said only, "The totals are right now." She baked bread. The first loaf came out of the stove on the fourth evening, and when Caleb ate it, he stopped chewing for a moment and looked at the bread and then looked at her and then looked at the bread again. And she watched him with an expression that might have been amusement if it had been allowed to develop fully, which it was not. It was the best bread he had eaten since Maeve. He did not say this. He did not need to. She saw it on his face and had the grace to let it pass without comment. But alongside the competence, alongside the bread, and the corrected ledgers and the kitchen that suddenly made sense, there were the other things. The things Caleb noticed because noticing was what he did, the way breathing was what he did without effort and without choice. The leather bag. During the first week, it sat on the bedroom shelf. By the end of the week, it had migrated to beneath the bed. He saw this only by accident, a glance through a half-open door. He said nothing. But he noticed that the bag was always within reach of wherever she slept. Always. The name. More than once in those early days, one of the hands passing through, or Silas himself addressed her cheerfully as Mrs. Harlan. Each time she answered without hesitation. Each time, just after, there was a half second where something in her face reset. A small recalibration. The expression of a person remembering which name they were using today. The mornings. Before she thought anyone was awake, Edith stood at the kitchen window with coffee held in both hands, looking north toward the ridge, not admiring the view, watching it, still and alert in a way that had nothing to do with the morning light and everything to do with whatever was running behind those gray eyes. It was not the posture of a woman settling into a new home. It was the posture of a woman making sure she had not been followed. Caleb saw all of it. He cataloged each detail the way he cataloged changes in the weather quietly, accurately, and without speaking about it aloud. He put these observations in the same place he put all the things he knew but was not supposed to mention. That place was getting crowded. Silas saw it too. He said nothing to Caleb because Silas Briggs did not comment on things that were not his to comment on. But in the second week, Caleb noticed that Silas had started checking the barn more carefully each evening before turning in, and that the colt on his hip, which had always been there, now seemed to sit a little more forward, a little more ready, as though the hand that might reach for it had shortened the distance by half an inch, without making a conscious decision to do so. 2 weeks after Edith arrived, Widow Crawford appeared at the ranch. She came bearing a pie and a mission, and it was immediately clear which one she considered more important. I just wanted to welcome the new Mrs. Harlan, she said, settling into the kitchen chair, with the practiced authority of a woman who had been sitting in other people's kitchens uninvited for 30 years. It is so rare that we get new faces in Dryden's Hollow. Edith offered coffee. The widow accepted. And over the next 20 minutes in between compliments about the curtains and observations about the weather, she deployed 12 questions with the precision of a surgeon. Where was Edith from the east? Which part Pennsylvania? Her family, were they still there? Some of them. What was her maiden name, Merritt? Had she been married before? No. How had she and Caleb met through correspondence? How romantic? Was it Edith supposed it was? Each answer was delivered without hesitation, without variation in tone, without a single crack in the surface. But Caleb, standing on the porch just outside the open window where he could hear every word, noticed something. On the last two questions, the ones about her family and her maiden name, Edith's voice shifted by half a tone. Higher. Tighter. A string pulled just past its comfortable tension. The widow did not notice, or if she did, she filed it for later. After Crawford left carrying her empty pie dish in a mental dossier that would be circulated through the town within 48 hours, Edith stood at the kitchen sink and did not move for a full minute. Then she began washing the coffee cups with the same steady hands that did everything else. That evening, Caleb watched her check 3 windows before turning down the lamp. 3 windows in order the way a sentry checks a perimeter. The next morning, Silas found Caleb at the barn. Widow Crawford asked me about Mrs. Harlan yesterday. Silas said, his voice as flat as if he were discussing feed prices, asked where she came from, whether she brought much with her. I told her I did not pay attention. Caleb looked at Silas. Thank you. Nothing to thank me for, Silas said. I truly did not pay attention. Then he went back to his work. They both knew Silas was lying. They both knew why. Neither needed to say another word about it. The weeks settled into a rhythm. Edith cooked and cleaned and kept the books and mended shirts and managed the household with a competence that made Caleb increasingly aware of how badly he had been managing it on his own. The house began to change, not in any dramatic way. Nothing about Caleb Harlan's life operated dramatically, but in small accumulating shifts. A pot of coffee already made when he came in from the barn. The ledger updated before he thought to check it. A button replaced on his coat that he had not mentioned losing. The quiet sounds of another person occupying a space that had been silent for 4 years. A drawer closing, something set down with precision rather than convenience. He started eating supper inside at the table instead of alone on the porch. He did not announce this decision. He simply sat down one evening because the food was there and the table was set, and it seemed stranger not to sit than to sit. Edith said nothing about it. She set his plate in front of him and sat across from him, and they ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised him, and which he suspected surprised her too, though she gave no sign of it. And at night after supper, he still sat on the porch alone, and he still smoked his pipe and watched the dark come down over the north ridge. And he still walked past the locked room and placed his hand on the wood and held it for one breath and moved on. But something in the ritual had shifted. Some weight in it had changed, grown lighter by a fraction he could not measure, as though the simple presence of another living person in the house had loosened something that 4 years of solitude had pulled too tight. He did not name it. He was not ready to name it. On a Thursday morning in the 5th week, Caleb rode into town for supplies. Haskell at the post office handed him the usual bundle, a feed invoice, a county notice about property taxes, and then Haskell held up a third envelope with a look on his face that was working very hard to be nothing at all. This one came addressed to the ranch, Haskell said. Not to you personally. He paused. The pause of a man choosing his next words the way a man chooses where to step in a field he suspects might be mined. It is addressed care of a Miss E. Ashford. Caleb took the envelope. Thank you, Haskell. Came from back east, Haskell added, which was both unnecessary and exactly the kind of thing Haskell always added. Caleb looked at the envelope. It was cream-colored and heavy, the kind of paper that cost money, the kind of paper that was chosen specifically so that the person receiving it would know that the person sending it had money and considered that fact relevant. It was sealed with wax, not a simple seal, a crest of some kind pressed clean and precise into the dark red wax, and Caleb did not recognize it, but he recognized what it meant. It meant family, it meant old money, It meant the kind of world that did not use plain envelopes because plain was beneath them. He put the envelope in his coat pocket. Haskell watched him. Caleb looked at Haskell, and something passed between them that was not spoken and did not need to be. "I do not read other people's mail," Haskell said quietly. "I know," Caleb said. He rode home. On the road past the edge of town where no one could see, he took the envelope out once more and looked at the crest in the wax. He did not open it. It was not addressed to him, but he held it in his hand and felt the weight of it, the real weight and the other weight, and for the first time in 4 years, something stirred in Caleb Harlan that had been sleeping since the afternoon he rode home and found Silas on the porch with that look on his face. Not love. It was not that yet, not even close to that. It was something older and simpler. The instinct that rises in a man when he understands, without anyone telling him, that something on his land is being reached for by someone very far away. That the woman sitting in his kitchen, fixing his books and baking his bread and checking the windows before she turned down the lamp, had come here not just to start something, but to escape something. And that the something she was escaping had just found her address. He put the envelope back in his pocket. He rode the rest of the way home in silence, and the Kansas plains stretched out around him flat and gold and indifferent, and the wind moved through the grass the way it always moved, and nothing on the surface of the land looked any different than it had that morning. But Caleb Harlan was different. He could feel it in his chest, in the place where he had been keeping the locked room, in the silence, in the 4 years of touching a door he would not open. Something in that place had shifted, moved over, made room. He was not ready to call it what it was, but he knew with the certainty of a man who had lived on this land long enough to read its weather before it arrived, that whatever was coming would not be small, and that he had already decided somewhere in the space between the post office and the edge of town that he was not going to step aside and let it pass. The envelope sat in his coat pocket, the rest of the ride home, heavy with the weight of a world he had never belonged to and had no intention of belonging to now. But the woman it was addressed to was in his house, on his land. And on his land, Caleb Harlan decided who stayed and who did not. That much at least was simple. He gave her the envelope at supper. Set it beside her plate the way you set down a tool. Plainly, without ceremony, without looking at her face when she saw it, because he had already decided that whatever was in that envelope was hers to carry, and the least he could do was not watch her pick it up. He did not need to watch. He heard it. The silence that fell over the kitchen was not the ordinary silence of two people eating. It was the silence of a room that has just changed pressure, the way the air shifts before a storm, when the sky has not yet darkened, but every animal in the field knows it is time to move. Caleb kept his eyes on his plate. He cut his bread. He chewed. And in the corner of his vision, he saw her hand reach for the envelope and stop. Hover. Then close around it in one smooth motion and pull it into her apron pocket, as though she had been rehearsing this exact movement for months, as though she had known somewhere behind those steady gray eyes that this moment was always coming and had already decided how she would handle it when it did. "Thank you," she said. Her voice gave away exactly nothing. It was a voice that had been trained consciously or by necessity to offer the correct words in the correct tone regardless of what was happening beneath them. Caleb recognized this because he had spent 4 years doing the same thing, saying the right words, holding the right expression, moving through the day with the surface of a man who was functioning while the interior of that man was standing in front of a locked door, hand on the wood, unable to move forward and unwilling to go back. They finished supper in silence. She washed the dishes. He went to the porch. The evening came down purple and slow over the ridge, and the crickets started their work, and the coffee in his cup went cold while he sat and listened and did not think about the envelope. He did not think about the way her hand had hovered. He did not think about the crest in the wax pressed clean and deliberate, the mark of people who sealed their letters, the way they sealed their deals with the full weight of money and expectation behind every pressed edge. He did not think about any of it, and yet when he went inside an hour later, the first thing he looked for was the envelope. It was gone. Whatever it had contained had been committed to memory or to ashes. He could not tell which, and he understood without being told that he was not to ask. He asked anyway. Not that night. He was not a foolish man. He understood the architecture of patience, and he understood that some doors are better approached from the side than from the front, And he understood that the woman in his kitchen had built walls that were not going to come down because a man she had known for 5 weeks asked a question over salt pork. But a week later, on a Sunday afternoon when the ranch was quiet and the sky was wide and pale and the only sound was the wind in the grass and the slow creak of the porch boards, Edith was sitting in the yard mending one of his work shirts with the focused attention she brought to every task she undertook. Her needle moved through the fabric in small, even strokes, and her face held the expression of someone who had long ago learned that keeping the hands busy was the most reliable method of keeping everything else still. Edith? She looked up. He almost never used her name. They both knew it, and they both knew that when he did, it meant the words that followed had been chosen carefully and would not be retracted. The letter, he said. Was it trouble? A pause. The needle stopped. Not a flinch, not a freeze, just a cessation of movement so controlled that it could have been mistaken for a natural break in the rhythm of the work. But Caleb knew the difference between a pause and a stop, the way he knew the difference between a horse standing easy and a horse standing still, and this was a stop. Why do you ask? Because your face went white when you saw it. She looked at him for a long moment. He held the look. He suspected not many people had done this with her, had met those gray eyes and stayed in them without glancing away or filling the silence with something soft and harmless. He also suspected that this was exactly what she needed. Someone who would not look away first. It was from my father, she said finally. You are not close. Not a question. He had stopped asking questions that were really statements somewhere around the second week. She seemed to prefer it that way. No, she said, we are not close. She looked back down at the mending. The needle did not move. He wants to know where I am, and you did not want him to know. He found out anyway. Her voice was quiet, and the quietness was not softness. It was compression, the sound of something large being forced into a small space. He usually does. Caleb was quiet for a while. A hawk moved in slow circles above the north field. The wind pushed through the grass and flattened it and let it rise again, and the shadow of a cloud moved across the pasture like something alive, something searching. Is he going to be a problem? Caleb asked. She lifted her eyes to his, and there it was again. That careful assessment. She was weighing something behind a door she had not yet decided to open, measuring the man in front of her against every man who had ever disappointed her. Every promise that had arrived wrapped in good intentions and left wrapped in nothing at all. My father is Henry Ashford, she said. He is a banker and a real estate investor in Philadelphia. He arranged a marriage between me and a man named Dutch Caldwell. Caldwell's family is in steel. The marriage was not a proposal. It was a merger. She paused. The needle still had not moved. I declined. They did not accept the decline. Another pause. My father does not accept things he has not decided. Caleb waited. He could feel that she was not finished. He could feel the way the words were moving towards something she had not yet said, the way water moves toward the edge of a drop before it falls. I met Caldwell twice, she said. The first time at a dinner party at my father's house. He was charming. He said the right things. He laughed at the right moments. Every gesture was calibrated to produce a specific impression, and it worked on everyone in the room. She paused. Almost everyone. What did you see? Nothing. Not at the dinner. But the second time at my father's office, I arrived early. He did not know I was there. I watched him speak to my father's steward, a man named Porter, who had worked for our family for 20 years. She was quiet for a moment. His voice did not change. It was still polite, still measured. But his eyes were different. They were the eyes of a man looking at a piece of furniture, deciding if it still served its function. And I understood then that this was a man who did not get angry when he did not get what he wanted. He simply found another way to get it, calmly, patiently, without raising his voice. She looked at Caleb. That is the kind of man who frightens me, not the ones who shout. The wind moved. The hawk above the north field adjusted its circle by a fraction riding the current, and the grass lay flat and rose again, and the afternoon light moved across the yard and touched Edith's hands and the unfinished mending, and the shirt that still needed 3 more stitches before it was whole. 4 months, she said. I have been running for 4 months. Before I found the arrangement service. Before I found this place. Before I came here. How long before he sends someone? He may already have. My father has lawyers and money and patience, And when all three of those fail him, he has men who do not ask questions about methods. Caleb nodded slowly. He looked at the north field. He thought about everything he had noticed and cataloged and filed away in the weeks since she arrived, all the small details that had no innocent explanation when you line them up side by side. He thought about the locked room at the back of his house and the reason he kept it locked and the fact that he had not yet told her about that. And the uncomfortable recognition that they were both of them, people carrying things they had not yet set down. "You should have told me," he said, not angry, just direct. "I know. I do not like surprises on my land. I understand." She straightened the shirt in her lap, smoothing the fabric with her palm, and he could see her preparing the next sentence. The one she had been building toward since she sat down, the one she had constructed and deconstructed and reconstructed in the weeks since she arrived, turning it over and over, the way you turn a stone in your hand, looking for the angle that will let it sit level. "If someone comes here looking for me, I will not ask you to lie for me," she said, and there was something in her voice now that was not composure, something smaller and more honest than that. "I will not ask you to do anything. If he sends someone and you want me gone, I will go. You did not sign on for this." He was quiet for so long that a person less composed than Edith Ashford would have filled the silence. She did not. She waited. She had the discipline of someone who understood that silence properly held was more eloquent than anything that could be put inside it. "You fix those accounts better than I ever did," he said finally. She looked at him. "And the bread is good," he added, which was the closest Caleb Harlan had come in recent memory to saying something he actually meant. She did not smile, but something in her face eased, the way a held breath eases when the body finally allows it. And she went back to the mending, and he stayed in the yard, and the hawk above the north field made one more slow circle before it dropped below the ridgeline and was gone. It was a Thursday, 4 days after the Sunday conversation. Caleb was in the barn checking the feed stores when Silas appeared in the doorway, unhurried as always, but with something in his posture that was not quite right, a degree of tension in the shoulders that did not belong to a man discussing feed. "Rider coming from town," Silas said, moving slow, the kind of slow that costs money. Caleb set down the grain bucket. He walked to the barn door and looked out. The rider was still a quarter-mile off, but Caleb could already see the coat. Too fine for the dust it was riding through. Too deliberate for the landscape it was moving across. Everything about the man on that horse was calculated to project a specific kind of authority. The authority of someone who was accustomed to being listened to and had never once considered the possibility that he might not be. "Stay in the barn," Caleb said to Silas. "Do not come out unless I need you. You will know if I need you." Silas looked at him. Then Silas nodded once, and it was the nod of a man who had taken orders in places where the stakes were considerably higher than this, and who knew the difference between retreat and positioning. Caleb walked towards the house. He went inside to get his hat. Edith was in the kitchen. She was standing at the window, and she had already seen the rider. And when Caleb entered the room, she was standing very still in the center of it, with her hands at her sides. Not frightened exactly, but the way a person stands when they are deciding in the space of a breath whether to fight or to trust someone else to fight for them. Her eyes found his. She said nothing. She did not need to. Caleb put on his hat and walked out the front door. The rider's name was Mercer, and he did not offer a first name, and Caleb did not ask for one. He dismounted with the careful ease of a man who had learned to make everything look effortless, and he smiled the way men smile when they are carrying authority they have not had to earn. "I am looking for a young woman," Mercer said pleasantly, "traveling under the name Ashford. I have reason to believe she may have come through this area." Caleb stood with his thumbs in his belt and looked at the man the way he looked at weather, without alarm, without hurry, simply taking accurate measure. "Who is asking?" "I represent her family. Her father is concerned for her welfare." "That is kind of him." Mercer's smile held. It was the smile of a man who had smiled through harder conversations than this, and expected this one to follow the same pattern. He was polished and professional and entirely certain of himself, and Caleb understood immediately that this certainty was both the man's greatest asset and his most exploitable weakness. "You have not seen her, then," Mercer said. "I did not say that." A pause. Mercer recalibrated. The smile adjusted by a fraction. The eyes sharpened. "She came through town," Caleb said. "Few weeks back. Stage brought her in. She moved on. He let a beat pass. The beat of a man remembering something that was not important enough to have remembered clearly. Heading west, she said, did not catch where exactly. Mercer studied him. Caleb held the man's gaze the way he held a fence post while the wire was being stretched. Steady, rooted, giving nothing and conceding less. He had already decided what he was going to say, and the decision had been easy. And easy decisions did not require reconsideration. "You live alone out here?" Mercer asked, glancing past Caleb at the house. "I do." Another pause, then Mercer nodded once. The nod of a man filing something away rather than accepting it. He said he was grateful for the help. He remounted with the same practiced ease, and he rode back toward town without looking behind him. Caleb watched until the road bent and took Mercer out of sight. Then he stood there a moment longer in the afternoon quiet. Then he turned and went inside. Edith was still standing in the center of the kitchen. She had not moved. The light through the window had shifted in the time he had been outside, and now it caught the side of her face and the line of her jaw, and she looked in that moment like someone who had been waiting their entire life for a verdict and had just heard it go the other way. "He is gone," Caleb said. She let out a breath, slow, controlled, but he heard it. He heard the 4 months of running in that breath, the stages and the rented rooms and the false names and the constant scanning of every street and every town, and he heard the moment when all of that exhaled just enough to let a single lungful of clean air in. "You lied," she said, not accusatory, almost wondering. "I told him you moved on," Caleb said. "You did move on. You moved here." He set his hat on the hook by the door. "I did not consider that a lie." She looked at him for a long moment, and something was working behind her eyes. Something that was trying to sort Caleb Harlan into a category she already understood, and failing because he did not fit any of them. He was not the kind of man who lied for personal gain, because there was no gain in this for him, only risk. He was not the kind of man who lied for romance, because there was nothing romantic about his delivery, which had been as flat and practical as a fence post. And he was not the kind of man who lied for sport, because Caleb Harlan did not do anything for sport. He worked, he ate, he slept, he touched a door he would not open. Those were the 4 activities that comprised his life, and lying to a stranger to protect a woman he had known for 5 weeks did not fit neatly into any of them, which meant it was something else, something she had not encountered before, and the not encountering of it was visible on her face in the brief, unguarded moment before her composure reassembled itself. That night, Silas found Caleb on the porch. He sat down on the step without being invited, which was unusual for Silas, and he spoke without preamble, which was more unusual still. "That man stopped at the saloon on his way back through town. Asked around. Someone told him you married recently." The crickets sang. The wind moved through the grass with the wee, slow patience of something that had been moving through grass for 1,000 years and intended to continue for 1,000 more. "So he knows I lied," Caleb said. "He will come back," Silas said, "and next time he will not come alone." "I know. I know too," Silas said. Then he stood up and walked back to the bunkhouse, and on his way he checked the Colt at his hip with the absent automatic motion of a hand that had been reaching for that same weapon for 35 years and had never once reached for it without cause, and who understood that the world turned without warning, and that the men who survived the turning were the men who had decided what they were going to do before the turn began. The days after Mercer's visit did not change in any visible way. The ranch ran as it always ran. The fences needed mending, and the cattle needed feeding, and the accounts needed keeping, and the bread needed baking, and the mornings came and went with the same flat Kansas light on the same flat Kansas grass. But something underneath had shifted. The way the ground shifts before a sinkhole opens imperceptible on the surface, catastrophic below. Caleb left the Winchester by the door now. He had kept it in the bedroom for years, more habit than precaution, but now it leaned against the wall beside the front door where he could reach it in 2 steps from any point in the kitchen. He did not explain this to Edith. She did not ask. She noticed, though. He saw her notice the way her eyes moved to the rifle, and then away from it, filing it in the same place she filed all the things she observed but did not mention. 3 days after Mercer's visit, Caleb made a decision. Not about Mercer, not about the man who might come back, or the men he might bring with him, or the father in Philadelphia who sealed his letters with a family crest and treated his daughter's freedom as a contract term to be enforced. About the room. He had been walking past it every night. Hand on the wood. One breath. Move on. 1,400 and something nights, give or take. And each night the ritual was the same, and each morning the door was still locked, and each day the room behind it remained sealed like a wound that no one was allowed to look at, including the man who had sealed it. 3 nights in a row after Mercer's visit, Caleb stood at the door longer than one breath. 3 nights he placed his hand on the wood and did not move on. 3 nights he stood there in the dark hallway with the sounds of the house around him, the quiet breathing of a house that now had two people in it instead of one, and he thought about what was behind the door and what it meant that he could not open it and what it would mean if he did. On the third night, Edith passed him in the hallway. She was carrying a lamp to the bedroom, and the light moved over his face, and she saw him standing there with his hand on the door, and she stopped. She did not speak. She held the lamp and she looked at him and he looked at her. And the moment stretched between them like a wire that neither of them wanted to pluck, because neither of them knew what sound it would make. Then she moved on. She took the lamp into the bedroom and closed the door softly and left him alone in the dark with his hand on the wood. On the fourth day he opened it. Not because she had told him to. She had said it once a week earlier after the conversation in the yard. I think you should open that room, not for me, ma'am, for you. He had said he knew, and he did know. He had known for a long time, perhaps since the day she arrived, perhaps since before that, perhaps since the morning he woke up and realized that he had been touching a door for 4 years without opening it, and that the man who did that was not a man who was preserving something, but a man who was afraid of something, and Caleb Harlan did not accept being afraid of anything that belonged to him. That was the thought that opened the door. Not healing, not permission. The simple flat refusal to allow fear to govern one more day on his own land. He opened it in the late afternoon alone. Edith was outside hanging laundry on the line. Silas was in the south pasture. The house was quiet the way it was quiet before she came, except that now the quiet had a different quality because now there was someone else's absence in it instead of only his own. He turned the key. He pushed the door. It swung inward on hinges that had not moved in 4 years, and the sound they made was small and dry, like the sound of something that had been waiting. The smell reached him first. Cedar, old paper, and something else. Something he could not name with language, but recognized in his chest before he recognized it anywhere else. The smell of a room that had been holding its breath. Maeve's things were there. The small mirror she had kept on the dresser. The ivory comb, cheap really, but she had loved it more than anything she owned. A stack of letters she had written to her sister in Missouri and never sent because the fever came before she could get to town. And by the time Caleb came home from the cattle auction, the letters were orphaned on the dresser, and the woman who had written them was gone. He stood in the doorway for a long time. He did not step inside right away. He let the air begin to move, let it carry the cedar and the paper and the other smell, the one that had no name, out into the hallway where it mixed with the rest of the house and became slowly just air. Then he stepped inside, and there on the dresser beneath the stack of unsent letters, he found something he had forgotten, or that he had forced himself to forget, which is a different thing entirely and harder and more deliberate, and the kind of forgetting that a man does not do by accident, but by sustained and daily effort. A letter, addressed to him, in Maeve's handwriting, unsealed. He picked it up. The paper was dry and light, the way paper gets when it has been sitting in still air for 4 years, and the handwriting was steady, which told him she had written it before the worst of the fever, when her hand could still hold the pen without shaking. He read it. It was short. She had never been a woman who used more words than necessary, which was one of the things he had loved about her, one of the many things he had loved about her, and the brevity of the letter was so perfectly and completely her that he had to stop reading after the first line and stand very still and wait for the thing in his chest to settle before he could continue. Caleb, if you are reading this, then I am already gone. Do not lock the door. Do not lock anything. Let the wind in. That was all. No goodbye. No, I love you. No instructions about the ranch or the cattle or the accounts, just that. The quiet command of a woman who knew her husband well enough to know exactly what he would do after she was gone, and who had written her last words not as a farewell, but as a correction, a preemptive correction of the mistake she knew he was going to make. He stood in the room for a while. He did not take anything out. He did not put anything away. He did not rearrange or clean or sort. He simply stood in the room that had been sealed for 4 years and let it be a room again. Let the air move through it. Let the late light reach the corner where it had not reached since the spring of 1878. Let the dust be dust and nothing more. Not evidence, not memorial, not punishment, just dust. When he came out, Edith was on the porch with folded laundry in her arms. She looked at his face, and whatever she saw there, she received it quietly, without comment, without the look of sympathy that people had been giving him for 4 years, the look that said, "I am sorry," and meant, "I do not know what else to say." She did not say she was sorry. She did not say anything. She stood on the porch with the clean laundry and the late afternoon light on her face, and she let him be a man who had just done a hard thing and did not yet know what to do with the space that the hard thing had left behind. He took the laundry from her. Their hands touched in the transfer, briefly, accidentally, the kind of contact that two people who are living in the same house and sharing the same work and eating at the same table cannot avoid forever, no matter how carefully they arrange the geography of their days. Neither of them mentioned it, but neither of them moved away as quickly as they might have. That evening, Caleb sat at the kitchen table. Not the porch, not the doorway, the table. And Edith recognized this as something even if she could not have explained what. He folded his hands on the surface and looked at them briefly, then looked at her. "The back room," he said. "The locked one." She waited. "My wife is in there." Then, reading her expression with precision, "Not she is gone. She passed. 4 years ago. Fever in the spring." He paused, started again. "But her things are there. Everything she had. I locked the door and I have not opened it since because I told myself I was preserving it." He stopped. "I think I was punishing myself. I was not here when she died. I was buying cattle 2 counties over. Silas rode for the doctor, but the doctor was 30 miles away. She was gone before I got home." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. Inside, the lamp on the table cast a circle of warm light that held them both, and beyond the circle, the house stretched away into its familiar shadows. But the shadows felt different now, less heavy, as though one of them, the heaviest one, the one that had lived in the back room for 4 years, had just been let out. "You got me instead," Edith said quietly. "I got you instead," he agreed. There was no bitterness in it. If anything, there was something working toward its opposite, though he was not yet ready to name it, and she was not yet ready to hear it. And they both understood this without speaking it, the way two people who are very different and very alike understand the exact speed at which the distance between them is closing. "The door stays open now," he said. "Good," she said. And that was all. She poured him coffee. He drank it. The lamp burned. The wind moved. And somewhere in the back of the house, the door to the room that had been sealed for 4 years stood open for the first time. And the air that moved through it was the same air that moved through every other room, because that is what happens when you stop locking things away. They become part of the house again. They become part of the air. They become part of the breathing of a life that has not stopped, even though there were years when it felt like it had. That night, for the first time, Edith did not go inside immediately after supper. She sat on the porch step and looked at the sky while Caleb smoked his pipe. They did not talk, but the silence between them had changed. It had stopped being a wall and started being something else. A room, maybe? A room with the door open and the air moving through. He did not have a name for it yet. He was getting closer. Then Silas came riding hard from the direction of town, and the sound of his horse broke the evening, the way a stone breaks still water, and Caleb was on his feet before Silas pulled up. Because he knew the sound of that horse, and he knew the difference between Silas riding easy and Silas riding with purpose. And this was purpose. This was the horse of a man who had carried urgent news across worse ground than this, and understood that the way you delivered it mattered as much as the news itself. Silas swung down. His face was steady, but his eyes were not. "They are back," he said, the man in the fine coat. But this time he brought 2 others, armed, and there was a 4th man, came in a 4-horse carriage wearing a vest. "Looks like a lawyer." Silas paused. "Or something worse than a lawyer." Caleb looked toward the house. Through the window he could see Edith standing at the counter. She had heard the horse. She was already still. "The man in the vest," Caleb said. "What did he look like?" "Blonde hair, maybe 45, wearing leather gloves, even though it is warm enough to go without." Caleb turned back to Silas. But before he could speak, the door opened, and Edith was standing in the frame, and the light from the kitchen fell behind her, so that her face was in shadow, but her voice was clear. "The man in the vest," she said, and her voice was very quiet. "Does he have blonde hair, about 45, wearing leather gloves in warm weather?" Silas looked at her. "Yes." A silence. The crickets had stopped. The wind had stopped. The entire prairie seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next word the way the land waits for rain. "That is Caldwell," Edith said. "He came himself." Caleb did not sleep that night. He did not try. There are nights when a man knows that sleep will not come, and the honest thing to do is stop pretending and sit with whatever is keeping him awake and look at it clearly without the mercy of darkness or the excuse of exhaustion. He sat on the porch with the Winchester across his knees and a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and he looked at the North Ridge. The moon was 3/4 full, and it laid a pale silver light across the grass that made the pasture look like the bottom of a shallow sea, and the wind moved through it in long, slow waves that rolled from east to west and disappeared into the dark beyond the fence line. It was beautiful. He had always known it was beautiful, even in the years when he was not capable of admitting it. And tonight, with whatever was coming, already saddled and riding toward him from town, the beauty of the land hit him in a way it had not hit him since the last spring Maeve was alive. He heard the door open behind him. He did not turn. Edith came out and stood beside the chair. She did not sit. She stood with her arms crossed, looking at the same ridge, and for a long time neither of them spoke, because sometimes the most honest conversation two people can have is the one where they stand next to each other and look at the same thing and let the looking say what the words cannot. "I do not want to bring this to your door," she said. "It is already at my door. It was at my door 3 minutes after that man rode in the first time." Caleb. She used his name the way he used hers, rarely and therefore with weight. "I need you to understand what my father is. He is not a man who lets go of things. He has lawyers and money and patience. And when all three of those fail him, he has men like Mercer who do not ask questions about methods." She stopped. Then quieter. "And Caldwell is worse than my father. My father wants control. Caldwell wants ownership. The difference is that my father knows when to stop. Caldwell does not." Caleb was quiet for a while. The moon moved, the wind moved, the coffee sat untouched. "On my land," he said, "I decide who stays. That is not sentiment, that is fact." She looked at him in the dark. He could not see her expression, but he could feel the weight of it. The weight of a woman measuring a man against every man she had ever trusted and every trust that had failed her, trying to determine if this one, this quiet, sun-dark, stubborn man on a porch in Kansas was different from all the others, or only different in the way he would eventually disappoint her. "If things go wrong tomorrow," she said, "then they go wrong on my land. And on my land, I answer for what happens." She did not say anything else. After a while, she went back inside, and he heard the door close softly, and he sat with the Winchester and the cold coffee and the silver light on the grass, and he did not think about what might happen in the morning. He thought about what he was going to do about it. There is a difference. One is worry, the other is preparation. And Caleb Harlan had never been a man who confused the two. Before dawn, he saddled a horse and rode to town. The road was empty in the gray pre-light, and the horse's hooves made a steady rhythm on the packed dirt, and the sound was the only sound in the world except for the wind and the distant call of something that might have been an owl, and might have been the land itself settling into the space between night and morning. See, the way old wood settles into the frame of a house, it has been holding up for a long time. Caleb did not ride fast. There was no need. The men in town were not going anywhere until they were ready, and Caleb had learned a long time ago that the man who arrives calm is the man who leaves standing. He had learned this from Silas, who had never said it aloud but had demonstrated it every day for 12 years, and he had learned it from the land itself, which did not hurry for anyone and did not apologize for his pace, and was still here when everything else was gone. The streets were empty. The sky was gray in the east, the color of old iron, and the air had the particular stillness of a morning that has not yet decided what it is going to become. Caleb went to the church first. Reverend Thomas Ames was already awake. He was a man in his mid-50s who had buried more people than he had married and who had learned over 30 years of ministry in towns that were too small and too hard for anything that was not essential. that the best thing a man of God could do was show up, stay quiet, and be useful. He opened the door before Caleb knocked, which meant he had heard the horse, which meant he had been listening for it, which meant that word of the strangers in town had already reached him through whatever invisible channel small towns used to transmit information faster than any telegraph. "Silas came by last evening," Ames said. "Told me there might be trouble at your place." "There might be." "What kind?" Caleb told him. Short, precise, no drama. A man from Philadelphia had sent people to collect a woman who did not want to be collected. The woman was on Caleb's ranch. The man's representatives were in town, and one of them was the man the woman had been arranged to marry, and he had not come to negotiate. Ames listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, the Reverend stood up and took his coat from the hook by the door and put on his hat. "Do you need a minister or a witness?" Ames asked. "Possibly both." "Then you have both. Let me get my notebook." He went to his desk and opened the drawer and took out a leather-bound notebook that he used for recording births and deaths and marriages and the other events that, taken together, comprised the official history of a town that did not have a newspaper and relied on its minister to keep the record straight. He opened it and wrote the date at the top of a clean page, and then he looked at Caleb and said, "Whatever happens today, it will be documented. And a documented thing is harder to deny than an undocumented one. That is the only power I have, but it is not nothing." Caleb nodded. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, considerable, and both men knew it. From the church, Caleb went to the post office. Haskell was sorting the morning mail, his thin fingers moving through envelopes with the practiced speed of a man who had been doing this work for 2 decades and could sort by address without reading. Though, of course, he did read, because Haskell was the kind of man who knew everything and said nothing, and that combination in a town like Dryden's Hollow was worth more than money. Caleb did not ask for a favor. He stated a fact. "If anyone asks about a mail addressed to the name Ashford at my ranch," Caleb said, "there has never been any such mail." Haskell looked at him. The look lasted 3 seconds, which was a long time for Haskell. Then he nodded. "Never has been," Haskell agreed. He did not ask why. In Dryden's Hollow, there were things men did for each other, not because they understood, but because they trusted. And trust in a place where the nearest law was 2 days' ride, and the nearest help was your neighbor, was the only currency that never lost its value. Caleb rode home in the early light. Ames followed on his own horse half a mile behind, and the two of them came up the road to the ranch as the sun broke the horizon and laid its first gold across the north field. And the creek along the ridge caught the light and sent it back. And the land looked the way it always looked in the morning, clean and wide and indifferent to whatever small human dramas were about to play out on its surface. Silas was already up. He had the barn doors open and was standing just inside the shadow line with the shotgun leaning against the wall beside him. Not in his hands, not hidden, just present the way Silas himself was present, quiet and available and ready. Caleb went inside. Edith was at the stove. Coffee was made. Bread was sliced. The kitchen was in order, every surface clean, every object in its place, and Caleb understood that this was not routine. This was a woman imposing control on the only territory she currently controlled. The kitchen could not stop what was coming, but the kitchen could be clean when it arrived, and there was a kind of courage in that, a kind of defiance that he recognized, because it was the same thing he did when he mended fence in a storm. You could not stop the storm, but you could make sure the fence was right when the storm hit, and that mattered even if no one else could see why. "Ames is here," Caleb said. "He will stay in the house until it is over." Edith nodded. She poured him coffee. He drank it standing at the counter, and they did not speak, and the silence between them was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who had said everything that needed saying and were now waiting for the world to respond. They came at mid-morning. The mist had burned off by then, and the day was clear and bright, and the road from town was visible for half a mile, and Caleb saw the dust before he saw the riders. 3 men on horseback. Mercer in front, the same fine coat, the same deliberate pace. 2 men behind him, and these were not the kind of men who smiled. They wore their guns on their hips, without coats to cover them, and they rode with the loose, easy posture of men who had done this kind of work before and expected it to go the way it always went. Behind the 3 riders, a 4-horse carriage, black, well-maintained, the kind of vehicle that did not belong on a Kansas dirt road and knew it and did not care because the man inside it had never in his life adjusted himself to his surroundings. His surroundings adjusted to him. The carriage stopped at the gate. Mercer and his men stopped 10 yards ahead of it. And then the carriage door opened and Dutch Caldwell stepped out. He was exactly as Edith had described him. 45, blonde hair lighter than straw, combed precisely, leather gloves fine-stitched worn despite the warmth, a vest cut so well it made the Kansas landscape look shabby by comparison. His face was pleasant in the way that certain faces are pleasant, arranged by nature or by practice into an expression that communicated goodwill without committing to it. He had learned very early that the right expression was worth more than the right words, and he had never found a reason to revise that lesson. He looked at the house, he looked at the yard, he looked at the fence line and the barn and the north ridge with the creek running along it, and his eyes moved over all of it with the calm, assessing gaze of a man appraising a property he was considering purchasing. Not admiring, calculating. Then he walked toward the front door. Mercer stayed mounted, the two gunmen stayed mounted, and Caldwell walked across the yard with the steady, unhurried stride of a man who had never been stopped by a closed door in his life and did not anticipate starting now. He knocked. Edith opened it. Caleb had tried to reach the door first. He had been at the counter 2 steps behind her, and he had moved, but she was already there, and she opened it, and she stood in the doorway and looked at Dutch Caldwell with those scanning, assessing, strategic gray eyes that missed nothing and gave away less. "Edith Wow," Caldwell said, and the way he used her first name was deliberate, intimate, a liberty he had not been given and did not intend to ask for. It was a claim, a way of saying, I knew you before this place, before this man, before any of this, and the woman I knew is the one I came for. This costume she was wearing, this Kansas wife, this pioneer woman with flour on her apron was a temporary fiction he was here to end. This chase has gone on long enough. "I will not go," Edith said. Her voice was calm and the calm was real. And Caleb knew it was real because he had heard the other kind, the practice kind, and this was different. This was the calm of a woman who had spent 4 months running and had decided somewhere between the moment she stepped off that stage and the moment she opened this door that she was done. "You can tell my father you found me, but I will not go." "Mrs. Harlan," Caldwell said, and the name was a concession wrapped in a dismissal, the verbal equivalent of a pat on the head. "This is no longer a request." Caleb stepped into the doorway beside her. The Winchester was in his hand. He lifted it, not aimed, not shouldered, just lifted. "On my land, everything is a request, and I am declining." Caldwell looked at him. It was the first time he had given Caleb his full attention, and the attention was thorough and cold and deeply unimpressed. He looked at Caleb the way he had looked at the fence line and the barn and the north ridge, calculating, assessing, determining the cost of removal. "Mr. Harlan," Caldwell said, and his voice had not changed. It was still polite, still measured, still carrying the particular authority of a man who had never raised it because he had never needed to. "I appreciate your hospitality toward Miss Ashford. I am sure she has been a pleasant guest. But this is a family matter, and I would encourage you not to insert yourself into it further." "She is not a guest," Caleb said. "She is my wife." "A piece of paper from an arrangement service is not a marriage, Mr. Harlan. It is a transaction, and transactions can be unwound. Not this one." Caldwell smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes, and it was not intended to. It was a tool the same way the gloves were a tool, and the vest was a tool, and the 4-horse carriage was a tool. Everything about Dutch Caldwell was a tool designed and maintained and deployed for a specific purpose, and the purpose was always the same: to make the person standing across from him feel small enough to step aside. He reached into his vest and withdrew a folded paper. Heavy stock, official seal. He held it out. "I have a warrant," Caldwell said, "signed by Deputy Sheriff Virgil Sutter of this county. It requests that Miss Ashford, also known as Edith Merritt, also known as Mrs. Harlan, present herself for identity verification in connection with allegations of marriage fraud in breach of familial contract." Caleb looked at the paper. He did not take it. He looked at the seal and the signature and the language, and he understood exactly what he was looking at. Not law, the shape of law, the costume of law worn by men who had enough money to dress anything up as anything else. "A familial contract," Caleb repeated. "Is that what you call buying a woman from her father?" Something moved behind Caldwell's eyes. A flicker. Fast. Like a snake in grass there and gone before you could be sure you saw it. The composure held. The smile held. But for 1 second, one fraction of a second, the surface cracked, and what Caleb saw beneath it was not anger. It was something colder. The flat, patient calculation of a man deciding whether the thing he wanted was worth the cost of what it would take to get it. "Reverend Ames," said a voice from behind Caleb. Ames stepped out from the side of the house. He was carrying his notebook in one hand and a pen in the other, and he walked with the unhurried dignity of a man who had stood at 100 bedsides and 100 gravesides, and was not easily moved by men in fine vests with folded papers. "I am Reverend Thomas Ames," he said, "minister of the church in Dryden's Hollow. I am recording the events of this visit for the county record. I would also like to note for the record that Mrs. Edith Harlan is a member of my congregation. Any attempt to remove her from this property against her will is being documented and will be submitted to the county court." Caldwell looked at Ames, the smile dimmed by 1 degree. Then Silas stepped out of the barn shadow. The shotgun was in his hands now. Not aimed, held across his chest at rest. His face was steady. His eyes carried the particular weight of a man who had made peace with the things he had done in hard places and was entirely prepared to add one more item to the list if the morning required it. "Easy," Silas said to one of the gunmen who had let his hand drift toward his hip. Just one word. Quiet, flat. The voice of a man who did not need volume because he had something better. Certainty. The gunman's hand stopped. The yard was very still. 5 men and 1 woman, and a morning in Kansas that had started clear and bright and was now holding its breath the way the whole prairie held its breath before the weather changed. Mercer, still mounted, was doing arithmetic in his head, and the numbers were not adding up the way he had expected. 1 rancher and a runaway woman had turned into 3 armed men, a minister with a notebook and a situation that was no longer private. Caldwell stood in the middle of it. He did not move. He did not speak. He held the folded warrant in his hand, and he looked at Caleb, and then he looked past Caleb at Edith, who had stepped out of the doorway and was standing beside her husband. Not behind him, beside him. Her hands were at her sides, and her back was straight, and her face carried the expression of a woman who had been running for 4 months and had just decided in this yard on this morning, in front of this man who believed he owned her, that she was never going to run again. "Edith," Caldwell said one more time, and this time her name was not a claim. It was a question. The question of a man who perhaps for the first time in his life was encountering a door that would not open regardless of what he pressed against it. "My name," she said, "is Edith Harlan." The silence stretched. The wind moved through the grass beyond the fence line. The hawk appeared above the north field, circling once, twice, riding the current with the effortless patience of a thing that had no stake in the outcome and would be there long after all of them were gone. Caldwell folded the warrant and put it back in his vest. He looked at Caleb one more time, and the look was not defeat. It was inventory. The look of a man filing a situation away, categorizing it, assigning it a place in the long ledger of things he had encountered and things he would deal with later or not at all, depending on the cost. Then he turned. He walked back to the carriage. He climbed in. He pulled the door shut. He did not look back. Mercer watched his employer's carriage for a moment, then looked at Caleb. "I will tell Mr. Ashford his daughter has settled," Mercer said. "Tell him something else," Caleb said. "If anyone else appears on this road for this reason, I will not come outside to talk. I will let Kansas law do the talking." Mercer held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then he turned his horse, and the 2 gunmen turned theirs, and the 3 of them followed the carriage back toward the road, and the dust rose behind them and drifted east and thinned and dissolved, and the yard was empty again, and the morning was quiet again, and the only sound was the wind in the grass and the hawk calling once from somewhere above the ridge. Caleb stood in the yard for a long time after they were gone. He stood there the way he stood at the end of a storm, not because the danger had passed, but because the stillness after danger has its own weight, and a man needs to stand in it for a while before he can move on. Edith was beside him. She had not moved. She had not gone inside. She stood in the yard where she had declared her name, and the sun was full on her face now. And she looked in that light like someone who had just set down a thing she had been carrying for so long that she had forgotten what her shoulders felt like without it. "He will not come back," she said. Not a question, a decision. "No," Caleb agreed, "he will not." They stood there a while longer. The wind moved through the grass. The hawk circled the north field. Silas leaned the shotgun back against the barn wall and went to check on the horses because that was what needed doing. And Silas Briggs had always been a man who did what needed doing and did not require a conversation about it first. Ames closed his notebook and put it in his coat pocket and went to the kitchen and poured himself a coffee and sat at the table without being invited because he understood that the morning had been long and that sometimes the best ministry was simply being in a room where people did not have to explain why they were grateful you were there. A week later, Virgil Sutter rode out to the ranch. He came alone, no weapon, hat in his hand. He stood in the yard and he looked at the ground and he said what he had come to say. Harlan, that warrant I signed, I have voided it. There was no legal basis. I should not have signed it in the first place. Why did you? Sutter looked up. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had done a small, wrong thing for understandable reasons, and who was now standing in the consequences of it. He paid me. I needed the money. My wife is sick. Caleb looked at Sutter for a long time, long enough for the silence to do its work, long enough for the man to feel the full weight of the thing he had done and the full weight of the grace he was being offered by a man who did not owe it to him. Do not let it happen again, Caleb said. It will not. I hope your wife recovers. Sutter nodded. He mounted. He rode away. And Caleb watched him go and thought about the strange mathematics of mercy, how it cost more than justice, but was worth more too, and how the men who understood that were the men who built things that lasted, and the men who did not were the men who built empires on paper and watched them dissolve in the first good rain. That evening, Caleb told Edith about Sutter's visit. She was at the counter, slicing bread for supper, and she listened without turning around, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "His wife is sick." That is what he said. Do we know what kind of sick? Caleb looked at her. I did not ask. We should find out, she said, if she needs anything. And she went back to slicing the bread, and Caleb stood in the doorway of his kitchen and looked at this woman who had been running for 4 months from men who wanted to own her, and who had just been the target of a fraudulent warrant signed by a man she had never met, and whose first response to learning that man's wife was ill was to ask if there was something she could do to help. And he thought that if there was a word for what he was feeling in that moment, it was not one he had been taught, and it was not one he was likely to find in any language he knew. But it existed in the space between gratitude and awe, and the slow, terrifying recognition that the person standing in front of you might be better than you deserve. The days after Caldwell's departure were quiet in a way that the ranch had not been quiet before. Not the hollow quiet of the years after Maeve, when silence was a weight that pressed down on every surface and made the house feel like a room with the windows sealed. This was a different quiet, an inhabited quiet, the quiet of two people who had been through something together and had come out the other side of it and were now doing the ordinary work of a life that no longer needed defending, because it had been defended and the defense had held, and what remained was simply the living of it. Edith wrote a letter to her father. She did not show it to Caleb, and he did not ask to see it, but she told him afterward, standing at the kitchen counter with her back to him, which was the posture she used when the words were difficult and the eye contact would make them more so. She had told her father she was married, settled, not coming back, that the arrangement with Caldwell had been dissolved the moment she boarded that stage, and that she intended it to remain dissolved. What did you say about the marriage? Caleb asked. We signed papers, she said, but we have not. He paused, not entirely sure how to finish the sentence with precision. We signed papers, she agreed. That seems sufficient. And if he sends someone to verify it, she turned around then. She looked at him with those direct gray eyes, and in them was something that was not composure exactly, but had composure's architecture. Calm on the surface, more underneath than she was prepared to show in daylight. Then we make it true, she said, quietly, clearly, without drama. He looked at her for a long time. The afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window, finding her the way it had been finding her since the day she arrived, and he had stopped telling himself it was coincidence. He had stopped telling himself a lot of things. Is that what you want? He asked. Because he was the kind of man who asked plainly or did not ask at all. I want a life that belongs to me, she said. I want land under my feet that no one can take back. I want to fix your accounts and argue with you about the drainage ditch and watch the light on the North Ridge in the morning. A pause, well, and yes, I think I want those things with you. It was the longest thing she had said to him since she arrived. He thought it was also the most honest thing anyone had said to him in years, maybe longer. "The drainage ditch does not need arguing about," he said. "It absolutely does," she said. "You have run it wrong since the beginning, and the spring flooding proves it every year." He stood up from the table. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. He stopped in front of her the way a man stops when he has run out of reasons not to. When every argument he has constructed against a thing has quietly dismantled itself and left nothing standing but the thing itself. He did not say anything. She did not step back. They were married properly in the spring at the small church in Dryden's Hollow. Reverend Ames did not ask unnecessary questions. The witnesses were Silas Briggs and Lottie Haskell, and both of them looked at Caleb during the ceremony with the expression of people who had been waiting for something for a very long time and were trying not to show how relieved they were that it had finally arrived. The church was small and plain and smelled of old wood and candle wax, and the morning light came through the single window on the east wall and laid a rectangle of gold on the floor between the pews, and Caleb stood in that light and waited for Edith to walk the short aisle. And when she did, he looked at her and knew 2 things simultaneously. The first was that she was the most complicated thing that had ever happened to him. The second was that he was not afraid of complicated anymore. He had been afraid of it for 4 years. He had locked complicated in a room at the back of his house and touched the door every night and walked away every night. And now the door was open and the room was just a room, and the woman walking toward him was just a woman, and the word just had never been less accurate and had never mattered less. Edith wore a dress the color of creek water and pinned her hair with the same plain wooden pins she had arrived with. And when Ames asked if she took this man, she said yes, without hesitation and without performance. And it was the most convincing yes Caleb Harlan had ever heard in his life, because it carried in it no decoration, no excess, no attempt to make the moment more than it was. It was a word that meant exactly what it said, spoken by a woman who had spent enough of her life surrounded by words that meant less. Silas shook Caleb's hand after the ceremony. It was the first time in 12 years. He did not say anything. His eyes were bright, but that could have been the wind. No one checked. Widow Crawford was there, uninvited, back pew. She sat through the entire ceremony with her hands folded and her expression unreadable. And when it was over, she walked past Edith on her way out and said low enough that only the 2 of them could hear, "I do not know where you came from, and I have decided I do not need to know." Then she left. It was the closest Widow Crawford had ever come to kindness, and Edith understood that, and she received it the way she received most things, with a steadiness that Caleb had initially mistaken for distance and had slowly come to understand was its own form of care. The weeks that followed were different, not dramatically. Nothing about Caleb Harlan operated dramatically, but different in the way a room is different when a window has been opened. The same room, the same furniture, the same imperfect angles, just breathing now. The backroom door stayed open. He moved nothing, changed nothing, but the door remained unlatched, and after a while the room stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like a room. Maeve's things were still there: the mirror, the comb, the unsent letters, the letter she had written to him. But they were not sealed behind a locked door anymore. They were part of the house, part of the air, part of the ordinary, ongoing life of a place that had people in it again. One morning early before Caleb was up, he heard Edith in the hallway. He heard her footsteps stop near the back room, and he lay in bed and listened, and after a moment he heard her move on without entering. She had paused at the open door the way he had paused at the locked one for 4 years, but her pause was different. Hers was not a ritual, it was respect. The acknowledgement of a room that contained someone else's history, someone she had never met, but whose absence she lived inside every day, whose comb sat on the dresser, and whose letters sat unsent, and whose last words to her husband had been the truest thing anyone had ever said to him. Edith did not enter that room. She did not need to. She understood that some spaces belong to the people who came before, and that the best thing you can do for those spaces is leave the door open and let the light in and not try to make them yours. Caleb heard all of this from the bedroom, and he did not say anything about it, and she did not know he had heard, and it became one more thing in the growing collection of things they knew about each other, and did not speak about the private archive of a marriage that was building itself not on declarations, but on observations, not on promises, but on the accumulated evidence of 2 people paying attention to each other in the small, daily, unremarkable ways that turn out in the end to be the only ways that matter. Lottie Haskell came to the ranch one afternoon with a basket of biscuits and a piece of news she delivered the way she delivered everything directly and without preamble. Mercer stopped at the post office before he left town, Lottie said. Asked my husband about any mail addressed to the name Ashford. My husband told him there was no such name on his rolls. She paused. My husband does not lie often. When he does, it means he has made a decision about who belongs here. He decided you belong here. Edith looked at Lottie, this plain-spoken woman, who was the first person in Dryden's Hollow to speak to her without an agenda, and something in Edith that had been held rigid through 4 months of running and weeks of watchfulness loosened just enough for her to say simply, "Thank you." It was not a large word, but Lottie heard what was inside it and nodded once and set the biscuits on the table and left without making it into more than it was. Her father sent one more letter that summer. Edith read it at the kitchen table with her morning coffee. She set it down and said calmly that he had accepted the situation. Caleb asked what had changed his mind. I suspect it was the part where I mentioned that I am with child. Caleb went very still. Are you? I am, she said, and she watched his face with the same care she watched the North Ridge, looking for weather. What she found instead was the thing she had seen only once before. On the evening he came out of the locked room and stood on the porch, and she handed him the laundry, and their hands touched, and neither of them pulled away. A man setting something down that he had been carrying for a very long time. The particular lightness of it, the way the body changes when it is no longer braced against something, the way the shoulders drop and the jaw unclenches, and the eyes for just a moment lose the distance they have been holding and come all the way to the present, to this room, to this table, to this woman, to this word, this one word that changes everything and nothing, because the everything was already changing, and the nothing was never really nothing at all. He pulled his chair around beside hers and sat down. He took her hand, the hand that was still holding the letter, the hand that had held 100 things steadily since the day she arrived, the hand of a woman who had run far enough and had decided finally that this was where she stopped. The drainage ditch, he said after a while. Tell me what you would change. She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, fully, without reservation, without the careful composure she wore the way other women wore jewelry, out of habit and out of protection. And the sound of it was better than he had expected, which was saying something because he had spent considerable private effort not expecting things about Edith Harlan. Outside, the spring light lay flat and gold across the north field. The creek ran full along the ridge, catching the sun in bright fragments that scattered across the water like coins thrown by a careless hand. In the barn, Silas was working with the quiet rhythm of a man who had decided years ago that this was his place and had never reconsidered. In town, Haskell was sorting mail and keeping secrets, and Lottie was baking bread, and Widow Crawford was watching the street from her window, and Reverend Ames was writing Sunday's sermon, and Virgil Sutter was sitting at his desk in the county office trying to be the man he should have been before. And all of them, every one of them, were part of the ordinary and perfect fabric of a small town in Kansas in 1883, a place that was not perfect and did not pretend to be, but that had decided in its own quiet and unglamorous way that the woman who came on the stage and the man who was waiting for her, whether he admitted it or not, were worth the small accumulated acts of loyalty that held a community together when the larger forces of the world tried to pull it apart. In the house, the back room door stood open. It always stood open now. The air moved through it freely, carrying the faint smell of cedar and old paper, and the late morning light reached the corner where Maeve's mirror sat on the dresser, and the light touched it gently, and the mirror caught it and held it for a moment and let it go. And in the kitchen, a man who had asked for plain and received something far more complicated sat with his wife's hand in his, and he listened to her talk about drainage angles and spring water flow and soil erosion along the North Ridge. And he listened the way he had not listened to anything in 4 years, with his whole attention, with every part of himself present and accounted for without any part of him bracing for it to end. He thought briefly about the letter he had written at the kitchen table on a night he could not sleep. The letter that had asked for plain and simple and uncomplicated. He thought about the woman who had arrived instead with her gray eyes and her leather bag and her 4 months of running and her father's money reaching across 1,000 miles of telegraph wire and dusty road to pull her back. He thought about the word partner, which he had underlined in that letter, and how the word had meant one thing when he wrote it and meant something entirely different now. Something larger and heavier and more honest than anything he had been capable of imagining on that sleepless night when the only company he had was a locked door and the mathematics of grief. She was still talking about the drainage ditch. She was explaining with the precision of someone who had studied her subject thoroughly exactly where the grade needed to change and why the current angle was directing water toward the southeast corner of the barn foundation instead of away from it, and she was right. She was absolutely right, and he had known she was right since the first spring flood after she arrived, when she had stood in the yard in the rain and pointed at the water running the wrong direction, and looked at him with an expression that said, "I told you so," without using any of those words, because Edith Harlan did not say "I told you so." She simply stood in the rain and let the rain say it for her. Because that was the thing he had finally learned. The thing the locked room had been trying to teach him for 4 years, and the letter from Maeve had said in 11 words, and the woman beside him had shown him without ever once saying it aloud. You cannot hold on to what is gone. You can only open the door and let the wind in, and trust that what comes through will be worth the pain of what went out. And sometimes, if you are lucky, if you are stubborn enough and honest enough and willing to stand on your own land and say, "This is mine and I will not move," sometimes what comes through the door is better than anything you had the courage to ask for. The wind moved through the grass. The hawk circled the north field one final time, riding the current in a long, slow arc, and then it folded its wings and dropped below the ridge and was gone. The creek ran on, the light held, and the kitchen was warm, and the bread was rising, and the books were balanced, and the door was open, and the woman who had come to this place carrying everything she owned in a leather bag was no longer carrying it alone. And the man who had sealed a room for 4 years had let the wind in, and the wind had brought with it something he had not had the courage to ask for, and he was holding it now in his hand, at his table in his house on his land, and he was not letting go.